gospel reading is found in John chapter 6. We read the first 21 verses. This passage is in two parts. In the first part, there is the account of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in his mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than a half year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "There is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will that go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces so that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. And then the second story, Jesus walks on the water. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. And he said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Here ends the reading. The Gospel of the Lord. A world of divine abundance. We are reminded that God made a world where there is more than enough to give abundant life to all. In today's epistle reading, the Apostle Paul prays that his readers may comprehend the breadth and length and height and depth of Christ's love and be filled with the fullness of Christ. In the gospel reading, Jesus not only feeds 5,000 with 5 small loaves and 2 fish, but there are 12 baskets of leftovers. These scriptures invite us to see things from a perspective of abundance in the world. The Gospel of John is full of stories of abundance. Consider the very first miracle of Jesus in chapter 2. And by the way, John never refers to these mighty deeds of Jesus as miracles, but as signs of the coming of God's kingdom. He wanted his readers to look beyond the mighty deed and see a sign of God's kingdom revealed in the life of Jesus. Jesus was at a wedding festival when the wine ran out. He instructed the servants to fill some large jars with water, holding some 20 to 30 gallons, and he turns all that water into wine, even the very best wine. It was a sign of God's abundance. In chapter 4, at a community well in Samaria, Jesus meets a woman who came to draw water. As an outcast in the community, she was socially isolated and economically poor. She lived a life of scarcity. Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but those who drink of the water that I give will never be thirsty." Later in the gospel, Jesus says, "I have come that you may have life and have it abundantly." In his beautiful departure speech in chapter 14, Jesus says, "In my Father's house are many mansions. There is more than enough room for you all in my Father's house." Whether it's wine at a wedding or water at a well or bread and fish served to people seated on green grass with 12 baskets left over, or a mansion in eternity, Jesus promises abundant life. Now, today's reading follows closely the text which we read last Sunday from Mark's Gospel. Jesus wanted to give his disciples a little time off from their busy travels here and there, preaching the gospel and healing the sick. They had barely time to eat, but their planned retreat was cut short when crowds of people hurried on ahead of them. And again, in today's reading, John's version of this event, Jesus and his disciples try to escape the crowds. But the people press in on Jesus because they see him healing the sick and performing other signs of God's power. Jesus and his disciples cross the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus takes his disciples up a mountainside. One would think that there they could find some privacy, but even there, a great crowd of people follow them. Now, John places this account in the context of the Jewish Passover festival, when the people are again looking for a leader like Moses, who led the Hebrews from their captivity in Egypt. But now it's Rome that has occupied their land, and they're looking for a new Moses, a new king. But again, the compassion of Jesus takes over when he sees the crowd, and he says to Philip, one of the disciples, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" You can imagine Philip getting out his calculator. 8 months' wages would not even buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. It would be about as much bread as we receive at Holy Communion. The gospel writer notes that this was a test of faith. Jesus knew what he was going to do. Another disciple, Andrew, takes inventory of the available resources. All he comes up with is 5 barley loaves and 2 fish from a boy who remembered to bring his lunch. Probably Andrew meant it as a joke that this boy's lunch might be shared among these thousands of people. And, well, you know the rest of the story. Jesus tells the people to sit down. There was a lot of grass there. I wouldn't be surprised if the gospel writer had the 23rd Psalm in mind as he wrote this account. "The Lord is my shepherd. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He restores my soul." Jesus takes the loaves and the fish, and after giving thanks, he distributes the food to everyone who was seated, as much as they wanted. When all had eaten their fill, Jesus told his disciples to gather what was left over. He didn't want anything to go to waste, and they filled 12 baskets. So what does this miraculous sign revealing God's kingdom mean for us? I'm thinking about how our faith gets tested. Just like Jesus tested Philip and the other disciples, they were faced with 5,000 hungry people. According to a 2021 United Nations report, 828 million people were suffering from hunger and malnutrition that year, and it hasn't gotten any better. Among that number were 45 million children suffering from severe malnutrition and stunted development. Jesus still cares that people have enough to eat. But where shall we find enough food to feed all these people? It's not that we don't have enough food in the world to feed everyone. It's more often the case of human greed and other evils of injustice that prevent people and the nations from sharing and distributing the abundance of the earth. There's the fear that lurks in human hearts that when we give, we will be deprived of what we need. So we hoard, we build walls to keep people out, we live with a fear of scarcity rather than with the faith of abundance. People are coming to our borders to escape war and poverty, seeking asylum. But how can we take care of them all? The need is overwhelming. In the year 2021, there were more than 2.5 million new arrivals from about 200 different countries. Jesus still cares that people flourish and have a safe place to live. But where are the resources to meet this overwhelming need? We could make a long list of urgent human needs around the world for medical care, education, housing. We're faced with a climate crisis that threatens so many with warming temperatures and droughts and floods and fires. But what can we do? Our resources seem like a drop in the bucket. Our faith is being tested. Imagine Jesus posing this test of faith in our churches. We see a need, but our resources are limited. We might expect the finance committee to echo Philip's concern. We don't have enough revenue to undertake this project. The consistory might reinforce Andrew's position that the congregation has a budget to cover its own basic needs, but not enough to meet all those overwhelming needs beyond the walls of the church. The worship committee might not offer any opinion since it takes care of the spiritual needs of the people on Sunday. The buildings and grounds committee might not be very happy about such a big crowd trampling over our nicely trimmed lawn. It's likely that we in the church would set more reasonable goals that match our resources and not count on a miracle. Now, I believe that finance committees and others in the church ought to make an honest assessment of their resources before launching new projects. I think where we fall short is that after making our calculations and assessments, we fail to take the next step of putting what we do have in the hands of God and asking God to bless it and multiply it. The disciples didn't have very much to start with, just 5 loaves and 2 fish, but in the hands of Christ, it was enough. God doesn't always come to our immediate rescue with a miracle. People suffer around the world. There's violence and conflict. Enemies deprive their foes of food as a weapon of war. It's often the children and women who suffer the most. But do we have faith that God is still at work? And are we willing to offer our limited resources to bring more abundant life with God's help? There are some more popular interpretations of the feeding of the 5,000 that downplay the miraculous aspect. For example, it's been suggested that the boy's act of generosity to give his lunch inspired others in the crowd to bring out their hidden stashes of food so that by sharing, everyone had enough. Well, that makes a nice story too, doesn't it? But I'll leave that to you to decide whether the sign that Jesus performed was a supernatural multiplication of the bread and fish or the unleashing of compassion and sharing among the people themselves. There's a popular saying that says, God helps those who help themselves, right? But I believe that making this story into a simple demonstration of human benevolence misses the main point that John makes in telling the story. It reveals God's power and love in the life of Jesus and how the Holy Spirit can work through us with our limited resources. God uses the common things of life, like bread, to carry out his purposes. I came across a poem that sees God in bread. Be gentle when you touch bread. Let it not lie uncared for, unwanted. So often bread is taken for granted. There is so much beauty in bread, beauty of sun and soil, beauty of honest toil. Winds and rain have caressed it. Christ often blessed it. Be gentle when you touch bread. The feeding of the 5,000 addresses the temptation to shrug our shoulders in the face of human need. Our resources are too few. The need is too great. But in the hands of Jesus, what we have is enough. When Mother Teresa came face to face with the masses of suffering and people dying in Calcutta, India, neither her knowledge nor her wealth seemed sufficient to make any difference. I understand in stature, she was a very small person. And yet, because of her willingness to give what she had, she gathered a small group of 13 to form the Missionaries of Charity. And in the ensuing years, this order of nuns grew, giving care to many thousands in orphanages and care centers. When Millard and Linda Fuller began Habitat for Humanity, there was a great need for affordable and decent housing for the working poor, but scarce resources. They started with just a small group of volunteers with a few hand tools. And yet their faith in God to bless and multiply their limited abilities and resources produced an abundance of houses all over the world. You might say miraculously. Now, I haven't even touched on that other miraculous sign in today's gospel reading of Jesus walking on the water. Like the feeding of the 5,000, it calls attention to the divine power of Christ. It reminds us that Christ meets us in the storms and dark times of life. He says to his frightened disciples, Be not afraid, it is I. But I guess that's a whole different sermon, and you've probably had more than enough sermonizing for today. And at the end of each worship service, we present an offering to the Lord, giving what we are willing to share out of God's abundance. We also offer prayers of thanksgiving and intercession. We place before the Lord our needs and the needs of humanity. At the same time, we ask, Lord, what do you want me to do? We hear the echoes of Jesus. What do you have to give? What we have might not seem like very much in view of the great needs around the world and in our own community, but in the hands of Jesus, it is enough. And sometimes, through a miracle, the result is abundance. We express our faith in God's abundance, again repeating the words which we heard from the epistle reading. Now to him who by the power at work within us is able to do far more than we can ask or imagine, according to his power that is worked within us. To him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all the generations forever.